All right, good morning, everybody. Yesterday, everybody was making you repeat that with vigor, and today we're tired, and I'm not going to do that. So welcome to the morning of day 2 of John J. Smart on Crime Conference. This is a violence prevention panel. So my name's David Kennedy. I am going to moderate today. I'm the director of the National Network for Safe Communities here at John Jay, which does applied violence prevention work across the country. I'm really happy with my guests today. These are not just colleagues, but friends, and got a lot of friends in the audience too, so welcome. So immediately on my left is Thomas Apt, who has worked in federal and state government around these issues, including here in New York City. He is currently at both the Kennedy School and the law school at Harvard. Must be really smart. And is focusing on violence prevention both domestically and internationally, and has done some of the most recent and important systematic analysis on these issues. To his left is Chief Bob Tracy, who had an illustrious career in NYPD here in New York City, was the chief crime strategist for the Chicago Police Department at the time that Chicago was doing its best in the modern era with respect to serious violence, and has recently taken over the Wilmington Police Department. To his left is DEVONE, who pioneered some of the most interesting community-based violence prevention work as head of the Office of Neighborhood Safety in Richmond, Virginia. And Richmond, California. The other dangerous Richmond.
I'm a Cal guy.
I've been talking about the two Richmonds for so long. So, and has his own very interesting new startup. He is the founder of Advance Peace, which is designed to take that work to scale nationally. And on my far left, Rosanna Ander, who is the founding executive director of the University of Chicago Crime Lab, which is devoted to playing a research and organizational role around evidence-based violence prevention and crime practice in Chicago. So, welcome. So let me set this up just a little bit. There is no greater need in communities than that people be safe. If people aren't safe, then nothing else works. And there are communities all across the country where that is not true. So some of us were part of the panel yesterday that addressed the question of whether there is a trending increase in violent crime in the United States. The UCR numbers are very much in the news and in people's mind. And if I can summarize the gist of that conversation, it was there may be a trend, there may not be, but there are communities all over the country where we have become accustomed to very persistent, very high levels of community violence. And that's not okay. So when I began this the work that I've been part of 30 years ago, there was nothing that worked predictably and meaningfully to address this kind of community violence. The very first field work that I ever did was in the mid-1980s in Los Angeles. And the crack epidemic was sweeping west from LA with its attendant violence and disorder. And at the time, LAPD was the most consciously, technically sophisticated police department in the United States. And in its thinking about its work, LAPD divided the world into what it called repressible crime and what it called non-repressible crime. And repressible crime was, in its view, the set of issues that an effective police department ought to be able to address. And it considered repressible crime things like robbery, burglary, theft of and from motor vehicles, that sort of thing, which from their point of view made sense. Those are the sorts of things that one can imagine addressing by patrolling, by answering calls for service, by undertaking retrospective investigations. It expressly did not consider homicide a repressible crime. It considered homicide a non-repressible crime. It took no responsibility and did not think it could be effective with people killing other people. And from its point of view, that also made sense. Homicide is of the moment. It's often inside and not outside. It's unpredictable. And even in Southern California, most murderers are not serial killers, and so locking up today's murderer doesn't do very much about the next one. So it and the policing profession in general did not think it could do anything about these issues. And unfortunately, the portfolio outside law enforcement was similarly sparse. That's not true anymore. And there are now things that we know work. There are things that we know we can put in place and that ordinary people showing up every day can make a substantial difference. Some of those are rooted in law enforcement, some of those are rooted in community action, but it is no longer the case that there's nothing that works and nothing that we can do. And my eyes are terrible. Is the Assistant U.S. Attorney from Newburgh here? Can you share with the room what you shared with me about 10 minutes ago?
Thank you. Hi, Alexi Matsu with the U.S. Attorney's Office, Southern District, New York. We're involved in the GBI Initiative in Newburgh, and I was sharing with David that we've experienced a over 50% decrease in shootings amongst the group members in January 1 through September 30th last year to this year. So it's really working, and it's really encouraging how much the folks there have really bought into the initiative, and I think that plays a huge part. From the police department to the community to service providers, it's really taken off and seems to have real staying power.
So this is good news. There are things that we can do that make a real difference. So that's the theme for the day. Things that we know work, how to get them done, how to make them better, and how to sustain them. And you have done some of the most recent scrutiny of all this, and what do we know?
Sure.
There you go.
So let's just sort of begin with the numbers and go from there. Last year, according to the FBI, there were about 17,000 homicides. That's about 47 a day, about 2 an hour. So in the space of the time that we're going to be talking, 2 people are likely to lose their lives violently. As we all know, the victims of homicide in the United States are disproportionately people of color. The number one victim of violent crime in the United States is a young black man. According to the CDC, the leading cause of death for young black men is homicide. Many of you may know that, but what you may not know is that homicide accounts for more deaths than the 9 other leading causes combined. So murder has a devastating impact on the least politically powerful among us. But we're all paying the price for homicide and for violence. We pay for it in higher taxes, insurance premiums, lower property values, and lost economic activity. When you ask people what to do about these chronically high rates of violence, you hear a lot of different things. But basically what you hear is, look elsewhere. People will tell you, look at poverty, look at employment, look at education, look at guns, look at culture, look at values. Basically, everything but look directly at the problem. And that's simply not what the science says. decades of research confirms what we should all know as a matter of common sense, which is that the best way to address violence is to account for it directly. Go right at the problem. Here's what we know. In any given American city, about 5% of the blocks in that city are going to account for 50, 60, 70% of the homicides in that city. If you look at people, less than 1% of that city's population are going to account, again, for 50, 60, 70% of the homicides. Everything that we know about violence reinforces this central understanding that violence is sticky, that it concentrates in certain places, among certain people, and around certain types of behaviors. In terms of places, violence doesn't concentrate in neighborhoods. We now know that it concentrates in micro-locations, often called hotspots. So it doesn't focus in a neighborhood. It concentrates around a certain liquor store, a certain nightclub, a certain drug house. In terms of people, we know that violence doesn't concentrate among certain classes of people, young men of color in a certain neighborhood. It's far more concentrated than that. It concentrates among impact offenders or shooters. What distinguishes a shooter? This is something that I've been looking at in my research. What distinguishes a young man who is poor, jobless, poorly educated, has unstable housing, but who is nonviolent from the very few who are violent? And I would say the difference is previous exposure to violence, trauma. Violence begets violence. And that's what distinguishes poverty from violent poverty, is previous exposure to violence. So the next time you think of East New York, or you think of Compton, or you think of Englewood, don't think of them as a group of dangerous people or a dangerous place. Recognize that those people and places are mostly peaceful, but plagued by a few hotspots or a few impact offenders. So the science tells us, not surprisingly, that if violence is sticky, then the strategies that target that stickiness are the ones that work best. We see this in policing. We see this in reentry. We see this in prevention. We see it in intervention. Again and again and again. The most effective strategies are the specific ones, the targeted ones, the ones that go right at the problem, engaging the highest risk places and people. This is not my opinion. This is not one study. This is not a dozen studies. This is hundreds of studies. My colleague Chris Winship and I did a meta-review looking at systematic reviews that encompassed over 1,400 studies. And these were our results, and they're confirmed by many other criminologists and sociologists. So this is what the evidence and data is telling us. So I want to conclude by issuing a friendly challenge to all of us. I suspect that most of you in this room identify as progressives. And I want to challenge you all as progressives to elevate the issue of violent crime and of homicide among the platform, among the constellation of issues. Let's not look at violent crime as a speed bump or a distraction, a threat to our other reform efforts, such as reducing mass incarceration. Let's realize that if we really care about the people that we say we care about, if we're really concerned with poor people of color, this has to be an important component of our overall justice efforts. Thanks.
Chief Tracy, you've been on the front lines of this recently in Chicago, which is one of the places everybody thinks of when they think about this issue. Now you're setting up shop in Wilmington, which is not one of the places everybody thinks about when they think about this issue, unless you know Wilmington, in which case it is. Where are you on this, and what have you learned, and where are you going?
Well, good morning, everyone. And David, thank you for inviting me to this panel. I've had the great fortune of 34 years ago starting in policing in the NYPD. And, you know, as we talk about innovation and reducing violence, I worked in the police department from 1984 to 1994, where we were very reactive and we thought nothing could be done about the crime. And we go to calls for 911, go to calls for service, and then, you know, we just try to solve a case, arrest offenders, and then just keep moving on to the next case. And in 1994, we had a gentleman named Bill Bratton come into the NYPD. Came from a smaller police department. What can this man tell a department of 40,000 members? Well, he told us a lot, and he taught us a lot. He showed us that if we apply business management principles to police work, and if we can be proactive in reducing crime, and we can measure it, and we can know what's going on to try to prevent the next crime from happening, those are the things that we did for many years, and community engagement, innovation, using technology. And I came up in that system for 13 years after Bill Bratton came in, and I was very fortunate. I was in the private sector for a few years after I left the NYPD, and then I had the great fortune of going to Chicago. Gary McCarthy was appointed as the superintendent of police, and he had asked me, would you come in and be my right-hand person? And we need to start CompStat, and we need to have business management principles, and we have a lot of innovation that he did. He saw in the NYPD, he saw in Newark, New Jersey, and he says, we need to apply this to Chicago to see if we can have some success, reduce the violence, community engagement, and make Chicago safer. Well, that was a challenge for me, but it was great since now I was the one that was running CompStat, not the one that was behind the podium answering CompStat. So there's a big difference. But what I found out, there's a heck of a lot more preparation when you're trying to run a city and trying to reduce crime and then try to put all these strategies together. David, some of the things that we did, starting CompStat from scratch, business management principles applied to police work, we used technology. We embraced the technology. We used predictive analytics, link analysis, social network analysis, Dr. Andrew Papachristos. We try is predictive analytics of the people that Thomas Abt was talking about, where we talk about not only hot spots, we talk about hot people. And these individuals are the one at the highest propensity to commit crime. So what do we do with those people? So we identify those individuals, and then we actually turn to the National Network of Safe Communities. And that's David Kennedy's work. And through focused deterrence, custom notifications, we apply that as one of the plans as far as an overall comprehensive plan to look how we can address these individuals that are at most risk and at most risk to the community. First, you don't give them choices, you give them options. And those options, they can take them, and if they're not going to take them, we're not going to allow them to do harm in the community. And it goes a long way. A lot of these other things, and I'll get to some of the numbers, we look at reentry. We looked at community engagement. We made sure that our officers were working the same beats every single time they worked, so they know the conditions, the good kids from the bad kids. They knew the conditions. We eliminated task force, because when you come in and you don't know the community, we were not about arresting everyone. We were arresting the individuals. We were surgical and targeted to the most violent individuals in the community. And that gained trust in the community, because they said, you know who these people are. Please, can you go arrest them? But if we don't have the same cops in the same community working every single day, no, we don't know who the individuals are. So with the help of technology, keeping the officers in the same area, help us gain trust, elicit trust from the community, and also make sure that we're taking people out of the community that are doing the most violence or getting the help that they need. And part of it, working with David, we moved on to custom notifications for the individuals that we couldn't bring into group violence intervention or gang call-ins, as we called them in Chicago. We went to their residence, and we gave them the message of how at risk they are. We talked to their families. We told them about the moral voice of the community. We had people speaking to them, the harm they're doing to the community. And we also came with social services to help them. And that's a game changer in Chicago as far as where the police just weren't out arresting everyone. We were looking to give them help first and actually give them warnings what's to come if they don't stop the violence. But at the end, we actually want to help them, and we care about them in the community. You know, we also worked with, working with academics. You know, we can't do this alone. First, we know we need to work with the community, but you're going to hear from ROSEANNA Ander, who's with the University of Chicago Crime Lab. ROSEANNA, immediately when I came to Chicago, signed an MOU with all our crime information and said, can you help us with this and help us identify where the risks are and where we can improve as a police department and where we can improve in the criminal justice system. And ROSEANNA Ander was key, and the University Chicago Crime Lab was key in helping us get to where we needed to be. We worked with academics in the University of Illinois, Chicago, Dennis Rosenbaum. We worked with Northwestern, Dr. Wes Scogan. We were willing to reach out and get out of our comfort zones and to try to do things because what we were doing wasn't working. And I'm happy to say a lot of these things we put in place, and under Gary McCarthy's leadership, before the president convened his task force on 21st century policing, we already had 90% of those suggestions in place. And the ones that we didn't have in place for contractual reasons, which is being addressed in Chicago right now. So what were the results of doing all these things? And the thing that tied this together was CompStat. It was the relentless follow-up, making sure that we implement, we execute, and we put these things in place for the better of the community. Lowest murders and shootings in 50 years. Numbers and per capita. 2 years running, 2013, 2014. We even improved the numbers in 2014. Lowest overall crime. 40% reduction in crime in over 40 years. And we did that per capita as well because we knew the population in Chicago was larger 40 years ago than it is today. So those are the type of things. And at the same time, communities were safer. And the engagement that we had in the community, putting the same officer in the same place. And we did this all with arresting 10 to 15,000 people less a year. Think about that. Getting lower crime, getting reduction in murders and violent crime, and arresting less people. Isn't that the goal? Making sure that we do this. So I left at the end of December 2015. My last days were in January. Went to the private sector, and then my calling came again. And I was fortunate enough to take an interview for Wilmington, Delaware. There was 35 national candidates, and I was the last one standing. And I'm fortunate again, because this is a city that has some of the issues that other cities are seeing, but they're not insurmountable. They are not issues that we cannot overcome doing this together. And the biggest thing I'm doing, in addition to the things that I talked about, is making sure the community engagement is the #1 thing that I do. Community meetings, out in front, trying to first gain trust of the communities that we never had trust with, and improve the trust in the communities that we had a little bit of trust. And it starts there, and then the rest of it follows. Transparency, and that's where I'm going to be. 5 months in, and I'm also, David and I are going to be working closely. David's already been down in Wilmington, Delaware, and I look to see some of the great results that you're having in Newburgh, U.S. Attorney, and I know we can get there because we've done it in Chicago, we've done it with partners, we've done it with the community, and that's where I want to see Wilmington go. But all this needs time. And the thing that I often ask, and I've asked my mayor, and I've asked the community in my engagements, yeah, there's no quick fix to this solution. I mean, it's fixed to this problem. The solution takes a long time. It needs sustainability, and that's what we need to do. And cities like New York and LA have sustained, and that's why they're having the successes. And cities like Chicago actually threw out the plan, and you can see the results that are happening today. And it's disheartening what's happening in Chicago. So thank you, David, and I know we're going to be taking questions after the panel talks.
Thanks, Chief. So there's a theme emerging here, which is not only can we do a better job than we used to do of violence prevention, but we can do it in a way that actually involves less law enforcement. One of the most recent peer-reviewed published articles on this is in the last but one issue of Criminology and Public Policy. It's a study of several years in Cincinnati in which these very focused approaches reduced serious violent crime by about 40%. They also brought citywide arrests down by about 40%. So that's a good direction. What we'd all want is to get the arrests down to nothing. Right? Whether one is a criminal justice abolitionist or a police chief, everybody wants as little law enforcement as is possible. And one way of doing that is to to build up and to invent new community capacities to do violence prevention, which, DEVONE, you have been doing. So let's hear about that.
Thanks, David. Good morning. So I'm going to apologize now for a cough that may show up at some point. So forgive me. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to be in your presence today. I want to take a bit from Thomas and the Chief in terms of 3 themes: focus on the right people, investment, and thereby creating the options, viable options. In the city of Richmond, I served as neighborhood safety director for 8 years between late 2007 and March of 2016. My job was a non-law enforcement job within city government, but I had one sole responsibility, and that was to reduce firearm assaults and associated injury and death. And I was able to convince the city at the time to hire street outreach workers as city government employees. And I asked the city to consider 2 requisites for those hires. We call them neighborhood change agents inside city government today. But I wanted them to be formerly incarcerated individuals. And I want you to think about this next one. And I wanted each of them to have a firearm charge in their background. And I wanted them to be full-time, fully vested city employees. And you can imagine, I can see by some of your faces what human resources came back to me with, what the legal department came back to me with. But I was able to convince the city manager to do it. And you know, everyone was concerned about this revolving door of criminality now inside city government. My answer to that was, that's nothing new, right? But today, of the 4 neighborhood change agents that we hired in February of 2008, 3 are still there. And now 1 runs the shop. And so it's important to understand that piece of this work around, 1, focusing on the right people, but having the right people to focus on the right people. A couple of things happened as I was doing my job in terms of realizing some things, because we embraced ceasefire and do embrace the ceasefire strategy. But what I found out in that, in terms of being able to focus and locate the right people and having some investment there, is that we didn't have any place to take them, right? And so what became important to us, or really real for us, was we couldn't offer the options. We didn't have options. And more importantly, the options we had, like many cities, weren't attractive, weren't legitimate, and weren't credible to the population that we're talking about. Understand that the people that, at least I'm talking about, are the most resistant to change, chronically unresponsive to social services and supports, and completely distrustful of the providers of them. So when you talk about providing someone with services and they tell you, fuck your services, I don't want your services, now what? Now what? Do we blame them for that, or do we back up and go back to the drawing board and figure out, what can we now do? Can we meet them where they are, but can we also meet them as they are, right? So very important that we be able to do that when these young people say, screw your services. So what we did in realizing this and confronting this is we decided to create a platform that was in fact attractive, legitimate, and credible. Now, how did we do that? Well, we had to engage. We had to ask them. We had to ask active firearm offenders who had avoided any criminal or legal consequence, what can work? And you don't just get to ask them. You have to engage them, hang out with them, be there, right? Every single day. And here's what we learned, and then I'll shut up. And this is what we're trying to take to scale in a few other cities. We learned that these individuals are waiting for us. They're waiting for us to show up with something that makes them lean in. They wanted to be engaged every day. Every day. Not intermittent engagement. Every single day. In New York, that means even when it rains or snows, right? Every day, right? They wanted help developing life goals and life maps. But they also acknowledged, even at 27 years old, they needed their hands to be held in negotiating, achieving those life goals within their life maps, right? They wanted to trust social services, but found it very difficult to. But they also acknowledged that they needed to be taken. They needed to be taken to those social services, even if they were in their mid-20s. They didn't need a referral. They needed to be taken by the hand and walked through that door. And they needed to be stayed with until they were ready to say, I'm now able to do this on my own. So you got to create the apparatus to do that. 4, we decided to raise private dollars to make sure that we could provide them with what we call a life map milestone allowance. Yes. So after 6 months of your 18-month engagement, sorry for not telling you about that part, right, that commitment, you can become eligible to earn up to $1,000 a month for 9 of the remaining months, 12 months of your fellowship opportunity with us, right? We understand you live in a very chaotic environment and space, and we understand that crisis is happening all of the time, and scarcity is happening all of the time. It takes you away from the things that may be important to you. So we want to make sure that based on your goal achievement with your life map, that we are rewarding your life development. So we did that. And today, the media would have you think that we're paying criminals not to shoot. But let me tell you something. If $9,000 got somebody to stop shooting who's committed to shooting, I'd take that deal. I'd take that deal. I'd take that deal, right? Now, here's where I think it gets really interesting. We decided, you know what? It's hard to dream about some stuff you don't know exists. So let me take you somewhere. How many of you were in the room when David said I was from Richmond, Virginia? You saw my response. I'm from California. And the University of California is way better than the University of Virginia, right? As far as I'm concerned, right? No offense to you Virginians in here. But every time we take a young man outside of the state of California and he says he's from Richmond, that's the response he gets from the folks he's telling. Oh, Richmond, Virginia. And he's like, no, Richmond, California. And the answer or rebuttal is, well, where's that? It's an amazing shift in that young man's mindset when he hears, I'm out here dying and people don't even know where I live or exist. So we take these young men outside of the state of California, but let me tell you how that works really quickly. We decided California travel will be to expose these young men for California exposures and exploration. They're going to do a lot of things that I won't get into during this travel, but they're able to travel with folks that are fellows that they go out shooting other people with, right? Outside of California travel or outside of the country travel, which we do both several times a year, the only difference or caveat is that they have to be willing to travel with someone that they're trying to kill and with someone who is trying to kill them. And we've been all over the country. We've been all over the world without incident, right? It's one of the most transformational opportunities that these young men have access to. Do they come home kumbaya and allies? Absolutely not. But it's hard to shoot and or kill the person that I stood outside of Nelson Mandela's cell with and experienced that with over time, right? We put a council of elders around these young men. Men of color, nearly retired or retired, who can demonstrate that they've had successes in life and family, to help us do some of that life coaching, life skills, cognitive behavioral therapy work, et cetera. And then finally, we provide a subsidized internship. And this is an important piece of the work after 18 months. We don't do it before the 18 months. Let me tell you why. I learned something in my role of getting young men jobs who said they wanted jobs, and getting young men jobs in an environment that says that that's all we need to do is get these guys jobs. No, it's not. They don't even want jobs, even if they tell you they do. They want money. And those are two different things, right? And so you've got to understand that, because if you don't, you'll place them on these job sites and frustrate them, frustrate employers, and frustrate city stakeholders. So rather than do that again, we decided we'll take 18 months to get to know these young men, understand their passion, understand their interest, get them ready for job, right? And then find them internships based on that so that we can place them in those internships and subsidize it with a livable wage. Why was that important? The jobs piece was important, but also an eye-opener for us, as well as the social services piece. And I'll leave it at here, because here's where we have to get to. We've got to understand that to simply say we're going to provide somebody services in an environment where services aren't prepared to provide themselves to these guys, we're setting these guys up to fail. And we're re-traumatizing these guys. And the other piece is to understand that these guys are not ready for those services, and those services are not ready for these guys. And we can do better, and we are doing better. When I showed up in the city of Richmond, we're the fourth most dangerous city in the country, 47 firearm-related homicides a year. Today, I don't know where we are, but today we're at 9 homicides as of today. And so 61% reduction to 71% reductions over the period of time that we began to engage these individuals in this deep end way. Thanks.
So, DEVONE, you're reminding me of my old friend Jim Faily, who was chief in High Point for a long time. Went way out on a limb in supporting drug dealers, not in as refined a way as you're talking about, but it was enough to get him tarred with Hug-a-Thug.
Yeah.
And he spent a lot of time being pretty exercised about this, and then one day he said, you know, I've been thinking about this. I am willing to hug thugs.
Yeah.
If it would turn their lives around, I will kiss them on the mouth.
No, David, you're right.
As a deterrence theorist, we thought that's a strong deterrent, and we were, but
yeah, I've been accused of coddling, no question about it, coddling. And I would argue, and I've been accused, quite frankly, from very progressive folks, in fact, that I'm providing too privileged of an opportunity for this group of individuals. And we can debate whether or not they deserve it, considering that on day one of each one of these young men's fellowship opportunity, each is suspected of murdering or injuring someone with a firearm, and each is committed to continue down that path on day one of their fellowship. And my answer, David, to that has been, maybe they don't deserve it. Maybe they don't deserve this privileged opportunity, but their next victim certainly deserves for them to have it if it keeps them from crossing that line again.
So, Chicago. The eyes of the world are on Chicago for good and sufficient reason. And Roseanna, I've seen you nodding along with pretty much everything that people have been saying, and you are in a singular position in Chicago of thinking about operations, of thinking about organization and coordination, of thinking about data and evidence and evaluation, and you are part of the core group in Chicago that is trying to help Chicago turn the corner. So talk to us about that.
Sure, thank you. And it really, it's hard to come after all of these folks. And I agree with so much of what was already said. I just want to maybe put into perspective for those of you who are not from Chicago and maybe haven't been reading all of the headlines about what's happening in Chicago into perspective. In 2016, we had almost a 60% increase in homicides. So relative to 2015, a 60% increase. And no offense to smaller cities, a 60% increase might not be as big a deal in a city with a very tiny population. When you have a 60% increase in a city of nearly 3 million people, that's a lot of people. And it really was an historic event. There was no historical precedent for cities, top 5 cities population-wise, to have a 1-year increase that big and that sudden. If you looked at the number of shootings and homicides in December of 2015, you would not have predicted what happened in 2016. Every month that month had a higher homicide rate, higher shooting rate than the year before. And so it really was an historic event and really unprecedented. And I think there's lots of conversation and debate, but I don't think absolute clarity on what caused it. And I think that it's really a constellation of probably several things. You know, the Laquan McDonald video, the heart-wrenching incident that happened, but then was put out into the world for everyone to see, this just unconscionable action, and in a city that didn't have a ton of faith and trust, especially in the neighborhoods with the highest rates of violence. That incident, plus you know, a change in leadership, we shall acknowledge that, a change in leadership at the top of the police department around the same time. An agreement with the ACLU that was put into place that changed policing practices and what information had to be recorded and how it had to be recorded. So a whole bunch of things happened all at once, and it's just very hard to be able to say with confidence what is the thing that drove the increase. I think one thing that made the increase even harder to turn around or think that it was going to self-resolve was some of the challenges with the police department. But I also think, you know, I don't want to live in a world where the only lever we're using to address the violence are police. I think police are incredibly important. I am one who really does think that we ought to be putting more resources, smarter resources into policing, not less. But I think that we also need to be thinking about what are the other levers that we have to address the violence problem. And unfortunately, in the state of Illinois, we were coming off 2 years of a state that had not passed a budget. So if you think about, you know, whatever the event was, whatever the set of circumstances was that caused that massive increase to start to happen in January of 2016, the tools in our toolbox, there were some challenges happening with effective policing, to sort of put it mildly. But the institutions in these neighborhoods that work with the populations at greatest risk, and I think there aren't enough of them and they're not always doing the right things, but those organizations, those institutions were decimated by the state budget crisis. So the ability to be resilient and respond to whatever this shock was, I think was really, really hindered as a result. So I think we definitely have our work cut out for us, but I do feel like everybody else on this panel, this is a solvable problem. We have to have the political will, and we have to be insanely focused on it in a way that I think is still a work in progress in Chicago. I think there's been, you know, some momentum, some things are starting to happen, but I grew up dirt poor. I was homeless as a child. I care deeply personally about poverty, but I think that it's a mistake to only focus, when we think about inequality, to think only about poverty. I think far more fundamental than inequalities around poverty are inequalities around safety. You know, if you think of Maslow's hierarchy, my ability to live and be safe is so fundamentally different than people who live in the same city that I live in. So I think we really need to be focused on, absolutely, let's figure out what the long-term sort of strategies are to address poverty. It is an important problem, but I don't think that that should be done to the exclusion of saying, what can we do today? What can we do this month? What can we do this year to address the violence that makes these neighborhoods really, really unlivable? Just to give you a couple of examples, Thomas mentioned Englewood. Even with the quote, miracle crime drop in the United States, where we were all breaking our kind of arms, patting ourselves on the back for all the progress, the homicide rate in Englewood was 76 per 100,000. That puts it on par with neighborhoods or countries that are the most dangerous places in the Western Hemisphere. That 77 per 100,000 in 2015, which was a good year, relatively speaking, went to 179 per 100,000 in 2016. The neighborhoods that were already struggling, that didn't see the full benefit of the sort of miracle crime drop in the United States, were the ones that suffered the biggest increases. And so I think we really need to be thinking kind of laser-focused strategies that really have potential. I think some of the work that DEVONE talked about, it's really encouraging to hear about that, because those are some of the things that we're starting to stand up in Chicago. We should have started a long time ago. It'll take a while for the impact to really be felt, because these things take time. This is not going to change overnight. There's important work being done in the police department to try to recognize the fact that, if we want a police department to do really high quality constitutional policing and build the kind of relationships that it needs with the neighborhood, we can't do that on the cheap, and we can't do that by training officers in the academy and then basically walking away from them after that. So I think there's, some important reforms, hopefully that'll start to happen, with the new consent decree. The state attorney general has announced that they're going to enter into negotiation with the city, given that the federal government has sort of stepped back from that. So I hope that provides some resources, but it is a huge challenge, and I get in trouble all the time with the mayor because he doesn't like to have it reinforced. But I really do think that Chicago is a city at the crossroads, and the decisions that we make over the next couple of years will determine whether we are a city that finds our way out of this, or we become a city where our best days were in the past. We are losing population through homicides and shootings, but also people are choosing to leave our city. Chicago is the only big city that is decreasing in population. And I think a huge reason is because of the violence. And they're leaving from the neighborhoods that we really need people to be staying in, the neighborhoods that need to have young men of color who can be role models for them. Those are the neighborhoods that are losing people. So I think that this is, really an existential threat to our city. And I think focusing on policing, focusing on some of these smarter kind of social service interventions, but in ways that are really focused on the individuals who are involved in the violence. And just to kind of paint a picture of who those individuals are, when we looked at who was shot or who was killed in 2016, 75% of them were over the age of 20. So it's really important that we fund prevention and intervention and do things in middle school and high school. We should not stop doing that, but that is not going to solve our violence problem tomorrow. If we don't have ways to engage the individuals who are 20 and older, who have been exposed to enormous amounts of trauma and violence. And one of the things that I say with one of the initiatives that we're involved in called the READY Initiative, which sounds very, very similar to what you're doing. It's an intensive transitional jobs, other support, CBT, recognizing that people that we're trying to reach are not going to be the ones signing up, and they may say, fuck you, the first time someone comes to their door and offers them this opportunity. But, this is a program that, we really think, we need to be focusing on those driving the violence, and we need to not give up on them, for moral reasons, but also I think for the future of our city. And just hearing the success that you've had already is definitely encouraging. But we need to be putting much more in the way of resources into that population. And I think kind of recognizing that while they may be a shooter, they've also been a victim. And I think it's important to start with that understanding that I don't think that there are many people. There are probably a few, but I don't think there are many people who are involved in the violence, who are shooters, who were not a victim first, and multiple times and in multiple ways. And I think that's an important thing to recognize as we're thinking about how we justify, in addition to preventing the future victimization, I think also recognizing that they have been failed. You don't end up involved in this violence if you have not been failed many times. So I'm going to stop there.
So, Rosanna, you're reminding me that we sit in circles in which we're working with, say, American government folks who are looking at Mexico and the Northern Triangle. And they are happy to say these are failed states. These are places where the government does not function, cannot provide public safety, where there is no faith in the power of the state. Nobody wants the help of the state when they are at risk. The agents of the state are seen as more hostile than one's own neighbors. These are failed states, and we look at them and we say, dude, we work in Chicago. I mean, these neighborhoods are failed states. They really are. So, Thomas, I want to ask you one question and then go to the floor. So you posed us a challenge, which is we need to have a genuine political commitment to and program for addressing this problem. And what everybody here has said is, while deeply imperfect, we actually know how to do this work in a way that makes a substantial difference. And it makes a substantial difference in the communities and in the lives of folks who need that difference the most. This is not a small issue for them or for these places, and making change really matters. So that is to say at one level that this is no longer the what works and what can we do conversation it used to be, although we all continue to do better. The question is really, why aren't we doing it? And if the big bridge is to get from where we are to having the national will and the national commitment to doing this, which is the challenge that you posed, how do we get there?
So this is really the question, and I'll just sort of talk about it personally for a second. I've been doing this work in various capacities, from teaching at a very rough school in D.C. to being a prosecutor and locking young black men up, to working with the Obama administration and Governor Cuomo. And I've been involved in advocating for these strategies in policing, in intervention, the use of research like the crime lab does for some time. And what happens when you're in the White House, when you're in the State House, when you're in a meeting with the mayor, is no one ever tells you you're wrong. No one ever says, oh, that won't work, we have a better idea. And no one, what you get, you don't get a hard no. You get a shrug. You get a, well, it sounds good, but this is not the soundbite that I need. This is not going to appeal to this base or that base. This is not a quick enough answer. This is not easily digestible enough. And so in my own career, having transitioned from government to academia and having decided to write a book, my first thought was, well, I've thought a lot about the evidence. I'll cobble that together and I'll publish it in an academic press. But if I published it in an academic press, who would read it? Academics. And ultimately, what we need is a public that is demanding of the politicians more than a shrug. At the end of the day, this isn't even about legislation. We don't actually need a lot of new laws to address this. This is just about leadership and money. I think the number is in the range of nationally between 100 million and 200 million. That is a drop in the bucket in terms of our federal government. That is not an unrealistic number. That does not require a remaking of the federal budget. And that's a few million in different cities. That money is around. We could fund these strategies. And that's something, and so I think what we need to do is we need to now, in addition to continuing to build the evidence, our knowledge of what works in policing isn't perfect. Our knowledge in terms of prevention isn't perfect. We all hope to get better and better at this work. I mean, focused deterrence has evolved over its lifespan and will continue to evolve. We all want to get better. But what we also have to do is break through and start doing better advocacy about this. And one of the things that we need to do as progressives is we can't be uncomfortable about this subject. We as progressives are the leaders in violence reduction. David is progressive. Gary Slutkin is progressive. All of these things are coming from progressive people. But we need Hillary Clinton to talk about it. We need Cory Booker to talk about it. We need Elizabeth Warren. This needs to go to the highest level. And we need to be willing to do that, because if we don't do that, then it's only going to be leaders on the other side like Trump and Sessions who talk about that. I'll leave it there.
All right, let's go to the floor. I think we've got microphones to run around. Questions, please, not speeches. I will cut you off. And let's start in the back here.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for tackling such a difficult subject for literally the first time in this conference. Two questions. One, Tom, you sort of just hit on it, and now I'm thinking differently about the question. Is the data disaggregated to say you are, 179 per 100,000? Is that like a general demographic statistic about the homicide rate, or is it disaggregated into race? And do we even want that number? Because my concern now is that by making it less of a we problem, it becomes less of a care problem. So that's question number one. Question number two is, for the chief, do you work with the first responders who are not law enforcement, not EMTs, the people who are in the hospitals and on the scene, to talk about like trauma, when we talk about the young men being traumatized? Do you incorporate any partnerships with those folks who are really, really critical in that sort of that pipeline of a traumatic experience?
And I should have asked, would questioners say who they are?
My name is Adam Foster. I run an organization called Prosecutor Impact.
So I think it's a difficult balancing act because I don't think we should ever shy away from the fact that this is disproportionately impacting poor communities of color. But ultimately, we have to engage beyond that community. And so what I think we need to do is message that while this disproportionately impacts one portion of our national community, it is relevant and we are all paying for it. And then ultimately the challenge is to extend our sort of circles of empathy or of self-interest. We can do it either way, and we should probably do both, to explain to the broader public so that we can gather those resources, so we can cobble together that 100, 200 million and say, this is in your interest, you should do it because it's right, you should do it because over time it'll cost you less money.
Can I just, so go ahead. I was just going to say on the data question, when you asked if it was disaggregated within the population, so the 179 per 100,000 is for Inglewood as a community. If we looked at young men in a certain age group, young men within certain social networks, it would be even higher. So that sort of, in a way, understates just how significantly concentrated and how elevated the risk is for certain individuals.
So the reason I ask, my concern is that we can move the margin by saying you're unsafe, but I'd also like to be interesting to say you're more likely to die in a plane crash than you are from getting shot by a person, and to be back on the rhetoric like these are dangerous people, we need to keep them away from us, to somehow express the likelihood that that would ever happen to you is ridiculous, so you really should care about the cost piece.
And your question about first responders, non-law enforcement personnel, firemen, and talked about the hospitals, talked about service providers, emergency providers. Yes, absolutely. They're an important piece. I mean, just yesterday, right before I took a train to come up here from Wilmington, I was late because I was at the Youth Advocacy Council that had academics, had public defenders, had hospitals representatives, and we're brainstorming with pilots on what we can do. First, to look at-risk youths from a very young age, working with the CDC, and what type of trauma affects them in their education process that actually leads to the issues that we have now. Getting to individuals that at an earlier age, so we could try to break the cycle, identifying it at an earlier age. I mean, one of the things that we do in Wilmington, and are assigned to my headquarters, we have victim services. We have child development through community policing. If we see things that are happening where it isn't abuse, we can report that, and they'll go in, these victim services, see if they can help this family out. And then we actually meet regularly as a council, and then we have a line of communication for things that are immediate. So it's very important. That's a great question going beyond policing, that we're all working together to identify individuals that we can help out.
I think I cut you off earlier, so let's go there.
So I really appreciated the way that you framed the inability of social services to connect with these particular youth. And I would just add that in a parallel world, it's exactly the issue with schools, that schools absolutely fail to engage and re-engage kids that have lost their way at the middle and high school level. And I would just point out that, particularly in Chicago, efforts around school reform were a catastrophic failure. And so to leave out what we're doing in schools, particularly what we're doing with middle school kids that are leaving school at that age in the wealthiest country in the world, is absolutely tragic. And I'm just wondering where that fits into beyond policing, and I don't want that to not be a part of the conversation.
So let me jump in on that one. And let's expand what you've just said. So it's not just the schools. The law doesn't work for these folks. Policing doesn't work for these folks. Healthcare doesn't work for these folks. And part of what has gotten us to the point of knowing that there are things that we can do that doesn't necessarily require fixing the schools and fixing all of those things, which becomes as important as it is, both Herculean and slow, right? We all thought we have to fix the schools or everybody's going to keep killing each other. At best, that gets us 20 years out, right? So what you're hearing, and tell me if I'm not speaking for the group, but what you're hearing from all of us is, yes, all those things are terrible. And it's still true that almost nobody that the Chicago schools fail in those neighborhoods will ever shoot anybody. We know who the people are who are most likely to shoot and be shot. We go directly to them and we intervene and we can make a big difference. So the old logic that says in order to stop the violence you have to fix all these other things, that's not right. Which doesn't mean that for all kinds of other reasons we ought to fix all those other things, but we don't have to travel that path to keep people alive. And that turns out to be really important. Over here somewhere. Please. You next.
You're next. Thank you, and this has been a great panel. I'm Nina Vinnick from the Joyce Foundation, and I have a question mostly for Rosanna, but for anyone else on the panel as well. So, Rosanna, as you well know, one of the issues that we're facing in Chicago is an incredible proliferation of guns, and illegal guns in particular, which really does set Chicago apart from some of the other big cities around the country. And so my question is, if we did everything that everyone on the panel is recommending, what's the sort of maximum impact we can expect in a city like Chicago that is overrun with guns, that every year takes upwards of 8,000 or 10,000 guns off the street? How close to zero can we reasonably expect to get when we're facing this sort of external threat from firearm availability?
Yeah, no, as you know, I mean, I used to work at the Joyce Foundation, and so I think it's an incredibly important thing to recognize. 90% of the homicides in Chicago occur with a firearm. Almost all homicides occur outdoor in a public place. So the sort of proximate cause, if you think about it, of homicides in Chicago is illegal gun carrying in a public place. There are lots of other things that, circumstances that feed into it, but that is just a fundamental fact. And so I like to think about it as a both and. I think we need to be figuring out I don't think we live in a world where the federal administration is about to take up the control, the sort of gun policy agenda, other than to maybe relax the existing regulations. And so, when you think about what can a jurisdiction with the levers that it has do to address the gun violence problem, I do think that there are really important things that police can do to do smarter, more targeted, more surgical police work so that they're focusing on the right people for the right things. And I think that's really important. I think that there are things through informal social control that people have talked about, ways that people in neighborhoods can help intervene when things are escalating and do a much better job there. And so finding ways to support and enhance the sort of informal social control is important. But I also think that we ought to be looking at what are the ways that we can reduce the likelihood that, when violence does escalate or happen, that a firearm is at the ready. And I do think that there are things that the state and the city are trying to do, stuff that you're involved in. And obviously, we're about to put out some data to really underscore, there's not a single gun store in Chicago. So it is hard for Chicago to unilaterally regulate its way out of this challenge. And it does need the county that it's in, which is a county that has a number of gun stores with guns that end up on the streets of Chicago. There's more that needs to be done there. That is, I think, a complement, not a replacement to the other strategies. And then, you can be in the city of Chicago and closer to Indiana, a state with very, very lax gun laws, than you are to the Loop area. And so, I do think if there are ways to think about sort of regional approaches to address the sort of trafficking of guns or the, guns going from the legal to the illegal market, those are things we should be looking at and doing. And, violence is such a sort of multifaceted phenomenon, and there's not going to be, a silver bullet. Guns factor into it. It is why the U.S. is so much more lethal, even though we're not necessarily dramatically more violent. So I think we need to be focusing on it, but I think we need to be realistic about what can be done with the levers we have access to right now. And so I think the sort of state gun dealer licensing work that Joyce has been supporting and others, it's really important. But I think no single strategy is going to be a silver bullet. But I totally agree that guns are an important thing to be part of the conversation.
David, could I have a liberty? Sure. I want to come back to your question, sir. What is your name? Because you didn't give it to us. Joshua, thanks for the question. I'm often asked, if you were doing something today different that you've learned, and you had an opportunity to go back 10 years when you started the Office of Neighborhood Safety, what would you do? My answer is I'd create 2 parallel tracks of street outreach. These skilled outreach workers have been critical, not only in the technical skills they bring to the work, their own background and experiences that lend to their competency in the work, but they bring a great deal of emotional intelligence to the work. And we get them really prepared to go right into the pocket, the very war zone of where gun violence happens in these communities, to engage a very difficult individual to engage. Within that same pocket, there are young people, younger people, who aren't picking up guns, who aren't shooting, but they're the next generation of shooters, because no other public system or community-based system of care is touching them. How do I know this? My team came to me a few years ago and said, we can tell you who the next round of fellows will be in the next 3 to 4 years. And my answer wasn't a healthy answer. I was so focused. I said, somebody better get to them, because we're going to stay focused on the guys we're trying to get at. And lo and behold, those individuals became the next group. And so what I would argue is that we need to create specialized capacity within our public system, schools, what have you, healthcare agencies, but also greater capacity even within our own community-based organizations to go and meet those individuals where they are, bring them into our services, and then began to overhaul the actually services platform that we provide them. We've had 84 fellows complete the fellowship over the last 6 years, through 4 18-month fellowship cohorts. We invited 114, 92 said yes, 84 stuck. Of those 84, 79 of them are alive, or 94% of them. Again, understanding who this population is. 83% of them haven't been injured by a firearm and since becoming a fellow, and 77% of them have not or are not a suspect in a new firearm crime by law enforcement. The importance of that is how that population itself becomes to change its own mentoring profile to that younger generation as well.
Thanks, DEVONE. I promised you, yes.
Hi. Oops. Hi. Thank you. My name is Lily Shapiro. I'm with the New York City Department of Probation. Thank you to all of you. My question actually follows up a little bit on what the previous question was about with respect to the availability of guns, but more importantly, the public narratives, the political narratives about who may legally own guns, right? And how do we grapple with these hard questions about race, about making people feel that their lives are valued, right? That they have either options or choices and will have some help making a way out of the lives they're caught up in when there are narratives about mass shootings, right? We've been having an entire conversation here about gun violence and nobody's mentioned Las Vegas, where a white man who was a legal gun owner managed to murder 57, I believe it was 57, maybe now it's 58. Apologies to the family of that last victim, where a white man managed to legally own guns and murder 58 people, right? So I'm curious because we as a department and as an agency that partners with community members seeking to engage young people of color around believing that anybody cares about them and that gun violence is wrong, how do we both fold this into our engagement with these young people and their communities? But on the other side of this, how do we, who have some power and some influence, incorporate what is going on more broadly into these discussions about the availability of guns and whose lives we're caring about?
So this is a pretty thorny issue. And I think that the best way to sort of parse it out is to acknowledge what Jeremy Ratcliffe, a criminologist, said recently, which is in the United States we don't have one gun violence problem, we have many. And I would argue that the 4 biggest gun problems we have are in order of numbers of deaths. And you can argue about whether that's the metric. The number 1 gun violence problem is suicides. The second number, in terms of most lives lost. The second is urban homicides, the ones we're talking about. The next greatest is domestic homicide, domestic violence-related homicides. And then finally, our mass shootings, which account for less than 1% of all homicides, but given the context, given the enormous horror, they demand our attention. The solutions to those problems are separate. There are solutions that would have an impact on mass shootings, unlikely to have an impact on urban homicides. Solutions for DV, unlikely to have an impact on mass shootings. So, and what I would suggest is politically, we need to create a comprehensive package that addresses each constituency. Because with suicides, it's older white men. With urban homicides, it's young black men. With DV, it's women, and with mass shooters, it's I don't know, it's everyone. And so that's what I would suggest. But I want to go back to urban homicide and guns. One of the key things that we have to understand about guns is it is not all about guns, and it is not about guns. It is the interplay between guns, hot places, and hot people. To have a significant impact on urban homicides, you don't have to deal with guns generally. You have to deal with guns in the hands of hot people when they intersect with hot places. And that's not a legislative question. And we don't have to address all of these other things. We should. But that's where the gun issue really, the rubber really meets the road for this problem, for this population.
Can I just say, it was a great question, and I'm glad you fielded it, not me, because you did it much more effectively. But I don't think that the answer is kind of what we're seeing in Chicago, where you have judges basically saying, you know what, even though someone's not legally allowed to have a gun, you know what, they live in a dangerous neighborhood, so no harm, no foul, no big deal. Because then I don't know how we unwind the arms race. And so, I do think that gun availability is a function, does have an impact on domestic violence, does have an impact on suicide, does have an impact on urban homicides. But I don't think that the answer is, let's just make them more available to everybody. I think that that is a net negative.
Hi, my name is Eric Alexander. I'm here representing the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth. I have to give you a little background to help you understand the question. I was sentenced to 50 years.
I'm going to do this, but quickly. We're running out of time.
Yes, I will. I was sentenced to 50 years Department of Corrections as a juvenile. I served over a decade of my life inside a prison before I came home. I studied psychology on the inside, so I'm familiar with Maslow, Freud, Jung, Skinner, all of those philosophers. So my question is, I've been home for 12 years, and after writing youth programs for YMCAs across the country, small clinic chains, and now working for an organization that seeks to end life without the possibility of parole for children, I haven't heard of using those formerly incarcerated and impacted as individuals for agents of change. I was proximate to the issue, so I understand the issue of gangs and gang violence better than both. You can't teach what I have inside of universities. So to continue to ostracize these individuals from the issue and actually give them meaningful employment to actually help them solve some of these issues. So here's my question. What are your thoughts on employing some of these juvenile lifers who have served 1 decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, 4 decades? I'm meeting guys who are coming home after serving 5 decades who have spent those decades studying disciplines that could actually help us solve some of these issues. So what are your remarks, what are your comments, what are your thoughts of employing some of these individuals, putting their feet to the pavement and using them to help solve some of the issues that we're talking about?
That's your whole.
Yeah. Where were you, brother? That's why
I missed your
talked
opening
about.
remarks.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
brother, they were there. I mean, we did just that. In fact, it was sort of mandated for me, as I share with the audience, inside city government to facilitate street outreach in impacted neighborhoods. I recommended to the city manager that we hire as full-time, fully vested and benefited employees in government, formerly incarcerated or returning citizens, and we did it. I also recommended that each of those individuals have a gun charge in their background, and took a lot of flack for that. But as I explained, and as your remarks suggest, it's had a huge positive or optimal impact on the work outcome in the city of Richmond. And in my last remark, that was my reference point. I think that we have to create more opportunity for that population to be inside of our schools, to be inside of our public health institutions, our healthcare institutions, and our community-based systems, because it is, as you note, these individuals who have some of the best emotional intelligence and skill sets to connect with the realities of these individuals in such a way that they then can actually capitalize and take advantage of what's being offered in the current platform.
So I'm going
to say, in Chicago, there is a program much like what he's done, being stood up to really work with those individuals, give them jobs, give them employment skills. It's a new initiative, but that's really who it's focused on and who it was designed by and for.
So I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 very quick questions and answers. Risco?
Hello, everyone. Risco Mention Lewis, Deputy Police Commissioner of Suffolk County, New York, and also founder of Council on Thought and Action, a support group for those previously incarcerated. My question is, we know how to reduce crime. We know how to look at the social networks. We know how to bring in those previously incarcerated. But my question is, when and where is that initiative that says we are going to stand up new social networks and communities all across the country so that so those neighborhoods can build? We can go in and we can clean it out, but how do we build those new social permanent networks like we do with Council of Thought and Action across the country as a part of policy? Thank you.
I mean, I think certainly in Chicago, we've recognized that just doing the enforcement stuff without really thinking about what's left behind and how do you build up the capacity of neighborhoods to be healthy, resilient places, it's not going to be a permanent fix. So I think it requires political will and resources. And you know, there's been a lot of change in Chicago, but I think that you know, just kind of trying to use the enforcement lever isn't going to work, and thinking about what is the capacity that's needed in the neighborhoods to be able to be more resilient is something that has to be really addressed.
I'm sorry, I'm talking about building those people who are previously incarcerated into new social networks, new positive social networks within their own communities. Not just as employment, but as new social networks to counter the old negative social networks.
So one more, please.
Thank you. I'm Reverend Ruben Austria from Community Connections for Youth in the Bronx. Question about the intersection of the violence interrupters, credible messengers. We call them credible messengers here in New York City, and we've seen how effective they are. Study just showed a like 2/3 reduction in felony reconvictions by matching formerly incarcerated mentors with young people. The question about the partnerships between police and credible messengers, one of the tension points that I see on both sides is kind of how closely are they going to communicate? Whose turf is it going to be on? A lot of credible messengers will say, you know, I don't even want to be seen with the police. A lot of the police will complain they're not communicating with us. What's the best practice as far as the connection and communication between those two groups?
So I'll take that one. You find law enforcement who will not work with credible messengers. You find credible messengers who will not work with law enforcement. There's also a large body of well-worked-out practice in which people on both sides have figured out how to have the kind of effective working relationships that can strengthen both of them. You can have effective law enforcement without credible messengers. You can have effective credible messengers without law enforcement. There are reasons to do that sometimes. But there is, just to say it again, a wide range of worked out relationships in which those parties have figured out how to work together in ways that respect the roles and the norms and values and the vulnerabilities of each. How you go about that's a longer conversation, and I'd be happy to have it, but the answer is there's an answer. Will you join me in thanking the panel?